Hello and welcome back to the How We Really Feel podcast. This is one of my in-between episode reflections, so it's just me today with no guests. In this episode, I'm reflecting on my conversation with Dr Elise, Professor of Urology, and Jilly Bond, pelvic health physiotherapist and current PhD candidate. There was so much in this episode, and I suppose I wanted to start again, similar to my last reflection, with the point of hope. There was a line that Elise said that really stuck with me, which was right at the end. She said, just because you've had pain for a decade doesn't mean you'll have it for another. And when she said that, I instantly thought of how that would meet the so many people that have had pain and discomfort for such a long period of time, so much so that the brain can't consider an alternative. It feels like it's a certainty that this pain will persist forever. And so I couldn't help but wonder how that would meet people, whether that would feel very hopeful and invigorating and opening of pathways to explore what might be able to change, or whether that would land as really unlikely. And I suppose the invitation here is for you to reflect. If you listen to the episode, if not, do go back and listen to it. If you listen to the episode, how did it meet you? And just even reflecting on that in itself can be so informative to see how your brain is processing. Is there still hope? Is there still curiosity? Is there energy and capacity to explore things a little more? Or is there a deactivation? Have things been closed down? Has the no hope filter been activated? And is that shutting off potential options for you? And as I say that for you to explore, there is absolutely no judgment. If we recognize that our brain is a prediction-making machine and it is only ever really trying to help us, but it naturally can't always do that in the best way for us, we sometimes need to step in and help it out, then there is no self-blame or fault in this. It's just how our brain is processing very difficult circumstances. But if we can spot that it's closing some avenues down, understandably so, we might be able to intervene a little bit to see if there is potential for opening up things a little bit. And both Elise, Jilly, and also myself has seen massive changes in people who've experienced long-term chronic pain and symptomatology when they're able to work with their bodies a bit more multidimensionally. So I hope that that quote gave you a sense of hope, and I hope at the very least it gave you a sense of curiosity to see what else there might be to support you on your journey. One of the things that can really help us with the sense of hope and make us feel like there are more options is when the experience of having symptoms goes from completely unknowable, confusing, makes no sense, to suddenly getting some kind of, or might not be suddenly, it might be gradually, getting some kind of clarity of, okay, this is happening because of this. This is the mechanism that is going on here. These are the different things that might have led to this. That doesn't always mean that we can undo whatever led to that happening, but it means at least we understand what's happening and we have a better scope of how we might then work with that reality, because we know what's happening under the bonnet a little bit better. And in this episode, there was the example given of experiencing UTIs. So Jilly was talking about how what started the symptoms that you experience with a urinary tract infection may well have been a urinary tract infection or multiple urinary tract infections, but that those symptoms, when they maintain, it doesn't always mean that there is an ongoing urinary tract infection. That actually the experience of having had that urinary tract infection or UTI, or the repeated UTIs, actually led to other physiological changes, including how your nerves are working, what's happening in your pelvic floor and the surrounding systems. And that then starts to maintain the sensory experiences that you were having initially from the urinary tract infections. When she was talking about this is something that I'm familiar with, and it's something that I'm familiar with professionally, but also personally. I was reflecting on my own journey. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in all of this, as some of you may well know, is because of my own experience with bladder issues. My experience started off with repeated urinary tract infections. I used to have repeated intermittent infections in my teenage years, came back again a little bit in university. And then when I finished university, an infection came that just didn't seem to go away. And at the beginning of this journey, it did seem to be that there was an ongoing infection or a repeated infection or infection that didn't clear up. But after a while, there was a change in my symptom experience. It felt very much UTI-like, but there was an evolution where things had shifted a little bit more. The pain, the sensory experiences, they were more than what they had initially been. And it didn't seem to be that it was an infection. It felt slightly different. But sometimes I would still get the burning as though I was having a urinary tract infection. It was very hard to get clarity on. But this process that Jilly was talking about, how our nerves can then get upregulated and how our brain can also change how it's communicating with those nerves in the bladder, that translated exactly to my experience. And it translates a lot to the experiences of many people that I work with in my clinic. The disruption on a physiological level, never mind the psychological level, on a physiological level, changes other things in that area. And we have very receptive and proactive nerves in our pelvis and in our genital regions and the surrounding regions. So our brain takes a lot of interest in what's going on there. And so if on top of that you factor in the stressful experience, the impact on life, the disruption that comes with experiencing something like a urinary tract infection, often there's shame and embarrassment too, we can understand how that kind of amplifies the degree of seriousness that the brain has given it and the degree of threat as well that comes with that. We know that threat, we know that stress are two of the things that really start to change that interaction between the brain and our nerves and the central nervous system processes, which is something that Jilly went on to explain in a lot more detail in this episode. And before I start exploring what stood out about what wisdom Jilly shared about this central nervous system and the role that it has in pain and pelvic pain, just to acknowledge Elise's point about the cross-organ sensitization, the cross-organ talk between nerves. And she talked about this one particular study in rats, which was finding that there was a 20% overlap in this crosstalk between nerves from the pelvis and the surrounding areas. So immediately I had this visual of this web of nerves in that area that we have that are all overlapping each other and talking to each other and can easily get a little bit confused and noisy, which brings me to the other thing that really stood out in my conversation with Jilly and Elise, which was Jilly making this distinction between how we feel when we feel something on the external of our body, so a little pinprick perhaps on our hand, we can locate it precisely where it is, even without seeing. We would perhaps be able to really detect the quality of the sensation, the sharpness. We might be able to identify what was being used potentially, in comparison to our ability to detect sensations internally. It is a much lower definition quality of awareness that we have. We just know that it's unpleasant. We can't really pinpoint where it's located. Sometimes identifying what the quality of the sensation is really difficult. And this is by design, right? This is our body's design. It doesn't really want us. It's not really that adaptive for us to be able to feel every internal process, which is great for the most part, but it's very confusing then when we're trying to make sense of internal pain and internal sensations that don't quite feel right. In fact, Jilly shared an insight that she borrowed from Professor Neil O'Connell, which was our body isn't really designed to let us know about things going on internally unless there is a threat. And so if we understand that process again on a physiological level, that we're only really meant to be made aware of something happening internally when there's some kind of threat. And we understand a little bit about how the brain processes threats, the particular dedicated areas and circuitry in our brain when there is a threat. Then we can understand how rapidly these things can evolve, and how rapidly they evolve, particularly when that threat is experienced very psychologically as well. So to give an example, when I was experiencing these weird sensations in my bladder, it was immensely threatening in my everyday life. It meant that I wasn't able to concentrate on work. It meant that I didn't trust that I would be able to go out without needing to go back and forwards to the toilet. It meant that I felt dirty and unclean in some kind of a way. It changed my self-perception. It meant that I didn't want to go out and about. There was so much additional psychological threat that came with this physiological symptom. And those layers really stacked up, because then it meant my brain was paying even more attention. My brain was even more threatened because of those experiences. And then that had an interaction between what was happening in those peripheral areas. So in my pelvis, in my bladder. And Jilly talked in this episode about an upregulation of nerves that can happen when we're particularly threatened or stressed, and how that then physiologically gives us more sensation. And so we get this building snowball that I've talked about before that kind of traps us in this cycle. The more threatened we are by it, the more psychologically burdened we are by it, the more our biology responds in a threatened sort of way, and the more that taxes us psychologically. And this shows us that that psychological experience is part of the physical experience. It physically influences it. It then gets impacted by it, and it influences it even more. So it's not that the pain is predominantly caused by our psychological experience. Absolutely not. There's all different reasons that we might experience pain. And Jilly and Elise both talked about multiple different reasons why we might experience pain, why we might experience all kinds of bladder symptoms. But it plays a role in how they evolve, how we experience them, and perhaps how they get exacerbated. So if we recognize that, then we recognize there are potential additional options and avenues for working with those physical experiences, even when we can't get complete control over the things that cause them in the first place. And certainly that is, the area of work that I have, and I look to help people influence. And it's also been my personal experience. And I know in the coming episodes, we're going to look in more rich detail about the role of emotions and trauma in these bladder and pelvic conditions, and give some more insight into how we might use psychological approaches to improve the physical discomfort also. There's always a balance to be had when you're dealing with difficult symptoms. Bladder, pelvic symptoms, broader chronic illness, which is trying to get some kind of clarity so that you can understand what you need to do to help your experience, whilst also not feeling overburdened and to have this heightened responsibility to try and micromanage or figure absolutely everything out, which can really be perpetuated when you don't feel like you're getting adequate support. So I want to draw your attention to something that Elise mentioned in the episode, which is her comprehensive history-taking form that she's developed. I had a good old look at it, and it is incredible. It covers so many different strands of potential important, relevant information when you're experiencing pelvic or bladder issues. It also gives you a really strong impression about how many different factors might be involved and how many different avenues there might be to start shifting things. So I'd really encourage you, if you're experiencing some kind of pelvic health issue or bladder issue, urological issue, to go and check that out. I'd also encourage you to recognize how looking at that form makes you feel. If it makes you feel like, oh no, I don't even know where to start and this is all too much, just recognize your capacity. That's okay. You don't need to look into everything. Perhaps bank it, come back to it when you feel like you've got a bit more capacity. But at some point, come back to it and explore if you do feel like you've got some capacity, and if you do feel like there are some avenues that it potentially opens up for you to explore more with your physician or whatever physician that you can access in the healthcare system. And to remind you, and this is a recurrent theme as we go through these episodes, you may have had really difficult experiences within the healthcare system. You may not have found people to participate with you particularly well as you're trying to find answers, but that's not going to be the case with every healthcare professional, and there are going to be ones out there that will support you and explore with you. So do keep looking and trying. When you find those people, lots of things can change, and it just takes one person to take you seriously and to collaborate with you. So don't give up hope on that. The other thing that the history form may make you wonder about is, well, if all of these things or some of these things have contributed to what I'm currently experiencing, what does that mean for now? Because these things have passed. And this is an excellent question. It's one that comes up a lot in my clinic. A lot of the time it's about the recognition of what might have kicked off what you're now experiencing, so that we can make sense of it, so that we can rule out other things that might be playing a factor. In terms of going forwards, it may be that some of these historical things are no longer playing a role, and it may be that some of them still are, and there is still scope for intervening on some of these things. That might be environmental things, it might be social things, it might be psychological things, and of course it might be very physiological things. So for example, our diets, what we ingest to drink, or, the lack of drinking certain things. It might be medications that we're taking, but it also might be the stresses in our lives, the way that we cope with certain things. And so it's not for you to figure out absolutely everything, but this is just a starting point to get down all the various different biopsychosocial influences that might be having an impact. And from there, you can gradually pace out which areas you feel up to exploring, which areas you feel most compelled to explore, which areas you think might have a role in figuring out how to improve things for you. So I want to go back to the quote from Elise in this episode. Just because you've had pain for 10 years doesn't mean that you're going to continue to have pain for 10 years. I found that so resonant and powerful and hopeful, and I hope you did too, or at least you can come to. And at the very least, I hope that you recognize you're not alone with this. There are lots of people out there that are dealing with this, but also trying to help people who are dealing with this. And I hope that's a comfort, and I hope that opens up choices for you in the future. If this reflection or the conversation that it was based on resonated with you, please do take a look at the show notes where you can sign up for more mind-body science, or you can simply find where the episode is that I'm talking about. Take care. If this resonated with you and you wish this knowledge was more common and embedded in care, please consider rating and reviewing this podcast so that we can spread the message and improve care. This conversation connects closely with the work I'm doing with Convatec Continence Care and their Me Plus programme, which supports people using intermittent catheters with both practical guidance and emotional wellbeing resources. If this is of interest to you and you'd like to find out more, visit convatec.com and access the Continence Care Me Plus resources. Links can be found in the episode description.